Today's video has been sponsored by BenQ. Final Fantasy is a series that has produced some of the greatest role-playing games of all time. However, it's no secret that its modern entries have been a bit more divisive. In particular, the recent mainline numbered entries. Make absolutely no mistake, Final Fantasy XIII and XV have their share of fans. There are people who deeply love these games. However, there's also a pretty substantial number of fans who walked away from these games feeling as though they were lackluster. Final Fantasy VII Remake achieved nearly universal praise. However, it's not a new numbered mainline entry. The dev teams certainly had their challenges when creating this game, but it's not like they had to introduce a brand new cast of characters in a brand new world, with a brand new story, concepts, etc. Final Fantasy XIV has had extreme success in this regard. However, there is still a huge desire to see that translated onto the single-player series. All of which is to say that Final Fantasy XVI desperately needs to be a banger. And today I'm here to say that I think that Final Fantasy XVI might not just be the best Final Fantasy in years, but one of the best Final Fantasies of all time, maybe. Let's start with one of the biggest issues that plagued modern Final Fantasy: Square Enix's proprietary engines. Crystal Tools, the engine that powered Final Fantasy XIII and the ill-fated Final Fantasy Versus 13, and of course the disaster that was Final Fantasy XIV 1.0, was an engine that ended up being an absolute disaster, something you can learn more about in one of my previous videos, the problematic development of Final Fantasy XIII. This would all eventually lead to Square Enix abandoning the engine and creating a brand new engine, Luminous Engine. And while Luminous Engine wouldn't struggle quite as bad as Crystal Tools, it was still not at all free of issues. So much so that titles that were originally planned to be built on Luminous, like Kingdom Hearts 3, saw development being scrapped and starting over on Unreal Engine 4. Future Final Fantasy projects such as Final Fantasy VII Remake would then go on to use Unreal Engine 4, and overall deliver a much better experience. Final Fantasy XVI, however, will still be using a proprietary engine. However, this is the same engine that is used on the current build of Final Fantasy XIV. When building A Realm Reborn, Creative Business Unit 3 took an early version of Luminous Engine, a version of the engine that was far from finished. However, they were able to take that off from the main branch, and in just a couple of years, able to create an engine that could power one of the most successful MMORPGs in the world. FF16 is reportedly running on a heavily modified version of this engine, all of which is to say that the team is using tech that they are intimately familiar with, and it shows as Final Fantasy XVI's development has been one of the most least problematic that Square has had in ages. Final Fantasy XIII had its issues with Crystal Tools, Final Fantasy XIV also had its issues with Crystal Tools, and had to be remade completely from scratch. There are entire documentaries on Final Fantasy Versus 13 and 15, and even FF7R, despite starting on Unreal Engine 4, still lost an unspecified amount of development time due to the firing of CyberConnect 2 on the project, which led to Square Enix having to move the game back in-house. From what we publicly know, Final Fantasy XVI hasn't had any major issues during its development. The only major struggle was that the game did face some delays during the pandemic. But with that said, this is one of the most problem-free developments that Square Enix has had for a major title in a long time. I mean, if you really want to go back, even Final Fantasy XII had some major issues with its development too. Matsuno leaving during the game's development due to health issues, the higher-ups at Square Enix inserting brand new characters into the game. If the development of this game is as smooth as it sounds from the outside, then this is a massive dub for Square Enix. Wanting the development of the game to go smoothly is also how they approached writing the story. And according to Naoki Yoshida, they didn't begin development on the game until they were absolutely confident about the exact story they wanted to tell. This contrasts heavily with the last mainline entry, Final Fantasy XV, which in its transition from Final Fantasy Versus 13 to 15 became an entirely different story, and even after becoming 15 still had its story moved around all over the place, such as its opening sequence being cut out to make a movie. To contrast this, Yoshi P has said that Final Fantasy XVI's story has had very little change throughout its development. They wanted to start the game with a unified vision that everyone on the development development team could agree to, and this has kept the game's development on track. Then there's the story itself, which I think is going to be an emotional roller coaster. I think Clive is going to be one of the most interesting Final Fantasy protagonists that we've ever seen. The setup of his story so far is an incredibly emotional premise. We'll get to know Clive starting in his teen years at 15, then we'll get to know him at 20 and 30 in an over decade-long quest for revenge. Seeing Clive's entire life laid out in such a manner is going to allow you to empathize with him, see all of his reasoning. Seeing him go from this teenager who's described to have an inferiority complex after failing to inherit the Phoenix at birth, and after losing his father, his kingdom, his brother, and everything that he held dear, becoming a slave for the murderers of his family, being branded on his face by them, in a quest to destroy the Mother Crystals and reset the power balance in Valistia, and if done correctly could lead to Clive being one of the most relatable protagonists in video games. Over this bittersweet journey, you'll also get to see his relationship with the game's lead heroine, Jill Warwick, be forged through over a decade of trials that him and her will face together, likely making their relationship feel incredibly believable. You also have your dog Torgal, who you adopt as a puppy. During the Rosaria invasion, Torgal and Clive are separated. However, during all that time, it is said that Torgal remains loyal to Clive, and they fight together after an emotional reunion. The premise of this story can deliver something absolutely heartbreaking, and for this reason, producer Naoki Yoshida has decided to go with an M rating for the game, not for the reason of showing off gratuitous things. This is because he wanted to avoid censorship and be able to depict whatever the story calls for. This is something that has impacted recent Final Fantasy games even. Games such as Final Fantasy VII Remake had to remove the original's iconic blood trail. In the Ultimania, this was confirmed to be due to the age rating restrictions. I love the idea of them working without having to hold back and manifesting their exact vision. And it's a team whose vision has been routinely praised with the success of Final Fantasy XIV, with Final Fantasy XIV Endwalker currently sitting at a 92 on Metacritic. The game's lead producer, Naoki Yoshida, is known for his excellent management and leadership skills. Kazutoyo Mihiro and Hiroshi Takai, whose previous work was Final Fantasy XIV Heavensward, a story often regarded as an absolute masterpiece, are returning to work on Final Fantasy XVI. Masayoshi Soken, my favorite composer since Uematsu himself, and a man who was personally hired by Uematsu, will be composing for FF16. And if you haven't heard this guy's music, you absolutely need to, as he's composed some of the best tracks in the entire series. And with the series with this much good music, that isn't to be taken lightly. The game's battle system is being worked on by the legendary Ryota Suzuki, known for his work on Devil May Cry 5, Dragon's Dogma, and Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Suzuki has a track record of helping build some of the best action combat systems in gaming, and Final Fantasy XVI will be the latest addition to his resume. But it's not just the combat in this game that I think will be stellar, it's also the world design. A world with over 6 major kingdoms in it, and one that opposes both the pure linear style of something like 13 or 7R, as well as opposing the pure open world style of Final Fantasy XV. While the game's story is ultimately a linear progression, there are still plenty of open environments for you to explore, without the game allowing you to get too far off track either and still maintaining a focused story. I believe this middle compromise is the absolute best way to approach things, and something that the older Final Fantasy games used to do fairly well. For all these reasons and oh so many more, I can see Final Fantasy XVI being one of the best FF games in years, and quite possibly one of the best FF games overall, but it remains to be seen until June 22nd, 2023. And now a word from our sponsor BenQ with their latest gaming monitor, the EX480UZ. This 48-inch OLED gaming monitor has 4K support, offering a top-notch gaming experience with its lightning fast 0.1 G2G response time, 120 120Hz refresh rate, and FreeSync premium technology. Its 4-side thin bezel enhances your gaming experience, and the built-in BenQ HDRI and Trevolo speakers add an extra level of immersion. If you find that this 48-inch behemoth is a little too big, the display mode allows you to use it as a smaller screen, which can allow you to turn that 48 inches into 27 if you'd like. Mobius gaming monitors embody the essence of simplicity, modernity, and individuality, letting you fully immerse yourself into the game. Having a chance to game on this monitor was an absolute thrill, and allowed me to see all of my favorite games displayed at the best visual quality. So be sure to check out BenQ's Mobius EX480UZ, with a link in the description below.